For all things Halloween. This is Hauntformer, and welcome back to another installment in the Campfire Storytelling Podcast. You know, I do love doing horror movie reviews on YouTube. But in order to do those, I have to set up my lights, I have to get my camera in focus, gotta make the set look all purty, you know. And then I have a very limited window for actually talking about the movie, because I've noticed that usually viewership goes down after the 7 to 10 minute mark. Here, for this podcast, I can take more time to really dive into the movies that I want to talk about, especially these newer films, because older films a lot of people have seen, they just want to see an overview of the movie, but for some of these new releases, people want to hear thoughts on them. I know this because I do, and so this podcast is a way for me to talk about these new titles in a little bit greater detail. So for all of you watching and supporting the Campfire Storytelling Podcast, I just want to say thank you. This podcast, I should say, is not only for talking about movies, but I hope to talk about short stories or books on the podcast, in addition to talking about the horror genre as a whole. I do want to make a future installment about jump scares and about gore, and I have different ideas in my head for the future of this podcast, so I'm really excited to get down to that in the future. However, I did a poll recently on my channel on the community tab, which you should totally subscribe to the channel and check out the community tab, by the way, because I like to interact with you guys and gals on there, and I asked of you, what do you want to hear me talk about? And I left a bunch of suggestions. Of course, The Munsters, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, and Hellraiser. If you're watching this, obviously, you're here for at least one of those. But also Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, the new series that is in the UK. And, of course, the Netflix Monster Dahmer show. I have a lot to say about that Dahmer show. And I have a lot to say about Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. And it was also the highest voted one from you guys and gals. So what I'm going to do is save those two for different videos and or podcasts. And today I'm going to talk about the other three. Three that I don't have as much to talk about, yet I still have thoughts that I want to share. So this podcast will be discussing The Munsters, the Rob Zombie Munsters, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, which is based off of the short story by Stephen King, and we'll get into greater detail about all of these. Also on Netflix, both of those are on Netflix, and the 2022 Hellraiser requel, boot, sequel, whatever, which is found on Hulu. I'm going to put timestamps in the description so you can hop around if you don't want to hear me talk about a certain movie or want to hear me talk about one more than another, but that's the order I'm going to go in. And we are going to start talking with The Munsters. So, The Munsters. Oh, gosh. I have some thoughts about The Munsters. I could have maybe made an entire video on The Munsters, but I'll try to keep it brief. There's only so many ways of saying the same thing, you know? But The Munsters is the newest film from rock star, director, writer, all of the above, Rob Zombie. Now, a lot of people have some thoughts about Mr. Zombie, and I gotta be real. When I first heard about Rob's work, I was not interested in the slightest. I'm not a huge fan of his, headbanger music. He's got a couple bangers, I'll admit. Mostly the ones from his movies that I like. But largely, I'm not a fan of that kind of rockabilly style, or whatever you want to call it, grunge style. But I will say, I took a deep dive into his movie catalog, and I'd like to make a whole video just talking about Rob Zombie's filmography. But I gotta say, I was more impressed than I thought I would have been. He certainly has an interesting style, to say the least. And a lot of that revolves around the griminess of the way that the movies are shot, the way the characters act and behave, There's usually a lot of profanity, a lot of vulgarity, and a lot of characters that you don't really like, and you're not really supposed to. A lot of his movies revolve around white trash type characters, trailer parks, and cartels and that kind of thing. And, you know, there's varying quality throughout these movies. Some of them are really good, like The Devil's Rejects, which is my favorite of his movies, and I think it's a really fantastic modern horror film. And there are some that are really bad and really not that good. And then there are some in the middle. And there are a few I'd like to talk about on the channel. 31 comes to mind, 3 from Hell, of course, his Firefly trilogy I've already kind of done a deep dive on. You can check out my video for that one. But when I heard he's doing the Munsters, I knew he was a Munsters fan, because, you know, he does Dragula and Herman's Hot Rod and all this jazz for his music. I knew he was a big fan of the Munsters, and when I heard about this new Munsters movie, I honestly was kind of excited, in a way, because I enjoy Rob Zombie's movies enough, and I am a fan of the original Munsters television run, which was on TV in the 60s, I want to say. I think it was popular in the 60s. Obviously, I wasn't alive in the 60s, but I've watched a lot of reruns of the show, and I consider it to be a great staple of classic television. Of course, Fred Gwynne, as the iconic Herman Munster, is a great treat, and something that the Munsters did really well was capture that wholesome, all-American family vibe with a twist involving monsters, and I thought that is a very fun way of doing it. You can incorporate, like, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and vampires, and Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman, and all of these characters. There's a dragon under the stairs named, Fluffy, I think? I'm probably wrong on that. He actually is featured in this new Munsters movie as, like, a throwaway little gag, and a little, nostalgia bait, I guess, for some fans. But when I heard Rob Zombie was making this Munsters movie, I'm like, you know, I can vibe with this. And he started posting pictures of the sets, and I'm like, okay, all right, the sets look clean, they look good, I'm getting excited. And then that trailer dropped, which you might be living under a coffin if you didn't watch that trailer. I really recommend you pause the podcast now, go look up the Munsters trailer and watch it so you know what I'm talking about. But it is abysmally bad in so many ways. The colors do not complement one another. They are harsh. They drowned out the makeup on the actors. The editing and sound mixing is just not good. The music is, like, very cheesy, like royalty-free stock music. The only good part is the ending, where it's in black and white and recreates the original show, which I don't know why this whole movie wasn't in black and white to fit the vibe of the television show more. But I digress. The trailer was really bad, and I really got cold feet about this movie. Now, one of the nice things I can say about the Munsters is the advertising didn't lie. Sometimes movie trailers are better than the movie, but I can happily say that the movie of the Munsters is better than the trailer, because that's not saying much. The Munsters movie is still really not good. It's really not good. In fact, I would probably have to go on record and say it's bad. It is bad. However, there are some silver linings. There are some shining stars. I think Daniel Roebuck as Grandpa was a good casting choice. I think he did a good job capturing that energy of the original Grandpa and also adding kind of a modern flair to him, to that character. I like the sets, and I thought some of the shots were creative and fun. The lighting is a little obnoxious, but on the whole, I thought it was fun. It was capturing that spooky Halloween family vibe, and again, those sets, I thought they were very cool and elaborate, so they kind of added to that. It sort of felt like a throwback to the 60s and to the 90s. But for whatever reasons, and I can talk a little bit about those reasons exactly, this movie was not very good. I think for starters, the casting of Herman and Lily specifically was a big detriment. We all know that Rob Zombie really likes to cast his wife, Sherry Moon, as the leading lady in almost all of his movies. And I have to say, I actually don't think she's a terrible actress, because some of these movies portray her in a good light. Specifically the Firefly movies, I think she does a fine job. In 31, I think she does a good job too. But here, she doesn't quite fit that seductive, flirty, fun vibe from the original Lily Munster. She overacts a lot in this movie and has a very phony accent that doesn't seem like she cares about the character. She's just maybe doing it to appease her husband as a gag, but it doesn't come across as genuine. And the actor that plays Herman, Jeff Daniel Phillips, he isn't terrible as the character, but for one, the voice is off. And that's maybe a nitpicky thing, but Fred Gwynne had this very warm, rich voice that was very fatherly and very sincere. Jeff Daniel Phillips' voice is like, "Welcome to Transylvania!" And it's very loud and nasally. And it's not that I think he did a terrible job, it was just the material didn't really give us the Herman that we grew to love in the show. In the show, Herman was dim-witted, but he had a genuine, wholesome heart, and that always shone through. Here, all we basically get is Herman is an idiot and does stupid stuff and laughs really loud, which is odd because his laugh is very boisterous and deep, yet he talks very nasally, so I was quite confused about that. But this Munsters movie is a prequel to the show in the sense that Eddie Munster does not exist. They do not live in 1313 Mockingbird Lane as of yet. This is about Lily meeting Herman for the first time and how Grandpa is kind of apprehensive to their relationship, and he wants to build her a husband. But despite that being kind of the overarching plot line, it really doesn't have a ton to do with the story. The story kind of alters and changes constantly. You have this like werewolf brother character who acts as the antagonist, I guess, although he's not very convincing. He's barely in the movie. It's just kind of to get the plot going in the third act, I suppose. And that's the weird thing, is the main catalyst for the plot, quote unquote, doesn't really appear until like the third act. It kind of just meanders around for a while with Herman and Lily dating. There are moments where Herman is like a rock star, but he's like a comedian. I don't know, the character got a little muddled. It almost felt like Rob Zombie was trying to project his own life or his own relationship maybe with his wife into this movie. And that wouldn't be a bad thing if it wasn't the Munsters. Like, I'm not sure why this was in the Munsters. Also, just fundamentally speaking, the Munsters was always about the family. You know, the caretaker who was a normal human, Lily and Herman dealing with their son, Eddie, and dealing with their father or father-in-law, Grandpa, and you get that dynamic in the household. That is what made it interesting, or how they dealt with the neighbors. But just seeing a world of monsters for a majority of the film, and focusing on their internal relationships with one another and trying to date and trying to balance that, didn't quite work. And a lot of the time is just meandering around to get to some semblance of plot. I suppose if you're not a hardcore Munsters fan and just wanted to watch something bright and colorful for October, put this on for your kids. I suppose they'd have a fun time. There's nothing vulgar in it. It is very odd that it is Rob Zombie because it doesn't feel like any of his other works. But if you just put it on for your kids, I'm sure they would like it. I'm sure it's fine. It's doing quite well on Netflix right now. But I think for anyone who wanted an actual Munsters movie, for anyone who wanted to see something from Rob Zombie that would continue in the wake of his good movies, that didn't really happen here. I'd say this is one of his least good movies. I have not seen The Lords of Salem. I have not finished his Halloween 2, but it's certainly on par with those, as opposed to his better catalog of films. Is it the worst thing I've ever seen? Probably not. I think it's a little too silly to even consider it to be that bad. Movies that take themselves really seriously, I usually scrutinize a bit more. This movie is playful and tries to have fun. There are some fun sequences and cool shots. In particular, there are a couple shots with this cool background that kind of looks like something out of Creepshow, with the choice of the color palette, and that's all fun. There's neat sets and music that is kind of upbeat, and again, I'm sure people would like it for Halloween time. But I think you could do a whole lot better in terms of family-friendly horror. Beetlejuice is a million times better than this. Even those Addams Family movies, or heck, even Hotel Transylvania could do you better than The Munsters. The lighting was just very obnoxious. There wasn't much of a story. There's barely any, like, development of the Lily and Herman love relationship. Like, if that's what the movie's banking on, so be it. Not what I would have chosen in particular for this movie, but fine. Let's say that's the main core of this movie, Lily and Herman falling in love. There's nothing about them falling in love. They meet, and they go on one date, and then they get married. And that's the whole progression of that relationship. There's no conflict in it. There's no misunderstanding that they have to work through. Maybe Herman does something buffoon-like, and Lily has to... There's none of that. There's a little bit of that toward the end of the movie, but it's hardly tapped into. It plays out exactly how you would expect. Toward the end, they move into the house that we all know and love from the television show. They have human neighbors, and they realize that they're living with a bunch of humans, and there are jokes that happen with that. Elvira, Cassandra Peterson, I believe her name is, makes a cameo as kind of the head of this neighborhood, representing all the humans, and they scare her, but she actually just thinks they're dressed up in makeup for Halloween, for a Halloween neighborhood party, and they all think that the neighbors are really monsters. So you get kind of some funny gags here and there. But what's weird is Herman and Lily, earlier in the movie, go to Paris for like a date, and there are humans there, right? And Herman's like, "Hey, everybody," or really, he'd be like, "Hey, everybody," and scares away all these humans. And they're like, "Oh, people are weird here in Paris," or whatever. Well, then later, when they see a human in their neighborhood, they freak out. They freak out like they've never seen a person before, when we know that not even 45 minutes ago, they saw humans in Paris. So, what gives? Continuity? It's for kids, I guess. Don't pay attention to that stuff. Alright, that's fine. I do think that had this movie been in black and white, had it focused just on maybe that Lily Herman dating area where it's about Grandpa, Lily, and Herman mostly, like, cut out that brother character. He didn't need to be in the movie. Cut down on the whole moving to Mockingbird Lane. Just make it about their dating and kind of an obstacle that they have to overcome in their relationship in order for them to fall in love. Something very simple, you know? It didn't need to be complex. The show was never complex. Have a good little moral lesson at the end. They had a few neat little nods, like I said, where they find their pet. I don't even know if they mentioned the car or anything like that, but it was just lackluster, and not just because of it being Rob Zombie. I knew what to expect when it came to a Rob Zombie Munsters movie, but what I didn't expect was for Rob Zombie, who is a major fan of the Munsters, to miss out on the things that made the Munsters so special. I was so confused with that choice. Considering he's a big fan of the show, you would think he would understand why the show was so effective for him as a viewer. But this movie was just not. It was hard to get through. There were barely any funny moments of levity, even to, like, crack jokes about. It was just overall a very blasé experience. And yeah, that's basically the sum up of the Munsters. What did you think about it? Leave a comment below. And let's move on to another Netflix movie, Mr. Harrigan's Phone. So, Mr. Harrigan's Phone is, as I said before, a new movie based off of a short story from Stephen King's newest, I believe, anthology book, Dead Things, which includes 4 stories. This one, named ever so fittingly after the short story, Mr. Harrigan's Phone. And it was directed by John Lee Hancock, whom I don't believe has done any other horror movies. A lot of historical drama movies, Saving Mr. Banks, The Alamo, The Highwaymen, and a favorite of mine, The Founder, which is about the founding of McDonald's. Has Michael Keaton in it. Great movie. But I digress. I say that to say that John Lee Hancock has not really done horror before, and this movie does not feel like a horror movie, really. It is produced by Ryan Murphy, Jason Blum, Carla Hacken, so some horror names in there are behind this project. And of course, having it based off a Stephen King story is all you really need to get this idea off the ground. Now, I watched this movie a few days ago, and what really drew me into it, aside from it being a Stephen King story, was that Donald Sutherland was playing the titular Mr. Harrigan. Now, I haven't seen him in a lot. I know he's in The Hunger Games as President Snow. But I just enjoy his presence whenever he's in a movie. And Jaden Martell, I believe his name is, plays Craig, the main character. He's the kid from It. And I like him all fine and well. He's kind of just the typical main kid in a movie to get the story going. But Donald Sutherland was the name that was pulling me to the movie in terms of a talent and actor presence. Now, having seen the movie, I can say that it is fine. I didn't hate it by any means. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but I can't say I loved it. It was maybe the most conflicting movie of the year for me. And funny enough, I usually am not a crazy fan of dramas, but for some reason, this movie worked better when it was a drama as opposed to a horror movie. The basic premise is, this kid named Craig, he goes to his church on Sundays and he reads the scriptures in front of the church. And this elderly, very rich billionaire gentleman, Mr. Harrigan, the titular Mr. Harrigan, who has poor eyesight in his older age, pays this young boy Craig to read to him, because he's a big fan of books. It's a Stephen King story. You gotta throw books or writing in there somewhere. It's probably set in Maine, too. You have this kid reading to this older man for $5 an hour. And they kind of form this bond, this relationship. Craig's mother has passed away. He lives with his father, but they're not like in a bad relationship. This isn't a typical Stephen King terrible abusive father thing. This is just a kid that's trying to escape his home life and talk to this man who has a lot of wisdom and knowledge in life. Craig is getting bullied at school and asks Mr. Harrigan for advice. And Mr. Harrigan says to be very harsh with these kids that are bullying him. Well, lo and behold, spoilers, I guess, it's kind of in the trailer, Mr. Harrigan passes away, and the phones that they use to communicate, these new iPhones at the time of the movie takes place, I think, in like 2007, so iPhones are relatively a new thing, the whole smartphone craze. But these phones that Mr. Harrigan and Craig use to communicate become a catalyst for Craig to call Mr. Harrigan even while he is deceased and vent his struggles to him when, unbeknownst to Craig, Mr. Harrigan hears him and actually takes vengeance on the bullies at his school. And this is interesting because this is the second movie this year that has to do with phones talking to the dead. The Black Phone was also a movie that came out this year, and funny enough, was based on a short story from Joe Hill's anthology book, Joe Hill being the son of Stephen King. So both Stephen King and Stephen King's son have written short stories about phones talking to dead people, and both of them have been adapted into movies this year. And I know this is kind of a self-plug, But I did make a short film called The Phone to the Other Side last Halloween that is about basically the very same thing. Something interesting, though, is how a concept about a phone talking to the dead can differ based on the writer, and I find that very intriguing. It can be the same basic premise, but a totally different way of executing it. The Black Phone was probably my favorite movie of the year, if not one of my favorite movies of the year. And Mr. Harrigan's Phone, again, is not bad, but it did have some questions that it arose in my head. One of the major ones was this felt like a movie that was not entirely written by Stephen King. What I mean is, it feels rather, I don't know if the word would be tame, or predictable maybe is a better word. Like, it didn't do anything surprising to me with the concept. Okay, kid calls dead man gets revenge on kid bullies. Okay, that's it. It feels like Death Note. Remember that Death Note, whether you watched the anime or watched the movie with Willem Dafoe, where the kid writes in the thing and then he says how people are going to die and then it happens? It was basically Death Note and the Black Phone together for 2 hours. That wasn't a bad thing, because I enjoyed Death Note and the Black Phone, so obviously I enjoyed this, but it really didn't do anything too fantastic for me. Now, from what I've heard with critics of this movie, there are themes and there are things missing from Stephen King's original short story. I would love to read that short story and see what this movie is missing, because it feels like it's missing something. I just don't know what it is. Again, not a bad movie. It just feels like there could have been more to this idea. I think, and this is funny for me to say, but the first half of the movie, before Mr. Harrigan dies, was the strongest part of the movie. Before the horror elements got there. Seeing how Craig and Mr. Harrigan interacted, especially seeing Donald Sutherland's performance, was, to me, more interesting than the ghost stuff. Now, the ghost stuff was interesting. I shouldn't say it wasn't. And there were some cool things done. This is going to get into some spoilers, but again, you kind of know the premise of the movie. But the kid that bullies Craig is found in the exact same position as how he left Craig in the parking lot after beating him up. So I thought there were some nice nods there. How would Mr. Harrigan know this? I don't know, maybe he was eavesdropping? I'm not totally sure. I can take that with a little bit of, I can take that with a grain of salt, I suppose. But, there was just an emptiness toward the end, where I'm like, is this just gonna end right now? And it just ends right then. I'm like, okay, I guess that was the movie. It wasn't bad. I would watch it again. I found it to be entertaining throughout, but to me, it didn't tread any new territory. It was basically a rehashing of other things I've seen before, kind of in a different package. And the one nice thing it gave were these in-depth characters, specifically of Mr. Harrigan and Craig. That's really why I would watch this again. The plot was a little bit lackluster for Stephen King. As an avid fan of King's work, I like to see the new and original concepts and ways he crafts horror. But here, it felt like it was a little bit tired. And I don't know if that was the way that this was adapted by the filmmakers or by the screenwriter, or whatever the case might be. I don't know how involved King was with this. But again, I would be curious to read that short story and see what's missing from this movie. The only real creepy thing, I guess, is earlier in the movie, Mr. Harrigan saves his phone number in Craig's phone. And he saves his name as Pirate King or something to that effect, because I guess when he was on Wall Street, people called him a pirate. I thought that was a funny thing, and that feels very King-like. And he saves a song as the ringtone, Stand By Your Man. This, older country song from, I want to say, the 70s. It's a good song, too. I've been listening to it. But every time this song plays in the movie, it adds this feeling of dread. And I don't know if that's just because of the song choice itself, or if it's because it indicates the horror is coming, or that the dead are calling out. I thought it was a nice add. It could have just been a normal ringtone, but the inclusion of the song and of the nickname that was given added some character flair, and that's the stuff I like. That's the stuff that elevated this from being just a generic ghost movie to being something with a little bit of heart and a little bit of character. There wasn't a lot of resolution at the end when it comes to how Craig ceases communication with Mr. Harrigan. It just kind of stops, and you're left wondering, is there anything more to this relationship? Is there any closure for Craig involving the passing of this father figure in his life? I didn't really quite get that closure. I'm not sure if it was completely necessary, but I would have liked it. So, at the end of the day, I would recommend Mr. Harrigan's Phone, but go into it more as a drama than a horror movie. Maybe as a dark drama. And I think you will like it more than someone seeking out a really scary thing from Stephen King. Because King has some really great works. I just rewatched Cujo. I need to make a movie review about it, because Cujo is a fantastic movie. One of my new favorites from King. You know, I love Christine, Pet Sematary, The Shining, Carrie. You know, he's got so many great works that are really creepy. And this one was creepy, but not outright really scary to me. So, those are kind of my thoughts on Mr. Harrigan's Phone. I know that was a little bit scattered. It was a good movie. It was fine. Could have been better. And that's kind of the consensus I've seen amongst other viewers. It could have been better, but it was fine. And I think that's sometimes for October, when you want a new thing to watch, that's all that your movie really needs to be. It's also PG-13, so if you're a younger viewer, you don't watch rated R stuff, you might want to give this one a watch. Now, let's move to my third and final review of this podcast. One of the most highly requested of late from you all, my subscribers. And that is Hellraiser. Not Hellraiser, Hellraiser. The new Hellraiser. So, I should be straight up in saying, I've only seen Hellraiser and Hellraiser. I've only seen the original Hellraiser from '87, and this new flick. There are a lot of Hellraiser movies, folks. I don't know if you realize this. I did not realize this. There are like 10 or something nuts. Hellraiser is based off of a short story from Clive Barker from his Books of Blood series, from what I'm aware of. Which is also where Candyman came from, so that's kind of cool. Clive Barker is kind of, if I had to sum him up in extremely simplistic terms, he's like the Stephen King of the UK. Would that be an adequate description? I think that's a pretty quick summary of who he is. Very prolific author, and written a lot of very famous stories. Hellraiser is perhaps his most famous, which is funny because it's just a short from him. But the legacy of Hellraiser and Pinhead and the Cenobites, the puzzle box, all that imagery is iconic in the world of horror. And it's funny because I watched Hellraiser for the first time not too long ago, and I really liked it, but you realize how little it's about Pinhead. Everybody, when they talk about Hellraiser, is like, oh, Pinhead. Doug Bradley is Pinhead. Pinhead's barely in the first Hellraiser, and I think that does the movie good. Apparently, the reason that Pinhead is on all the posters and everything is because it was made in the 80s, during the slasher era, when Jason, Freddy, Michael Myers, and now Chucky at that point became common monster goons in their own right. And the producers of the movie, much to Clive Barker's dismay, said, hey, we're going to put this guy with pins sticking out of his head on the poster. He was just a Cenobite at that point, but he got the nickname Pinhead, and the rest is history. Apparently Clive Barker doesn't like the name Pinhead. I'm going to use it in this review because it's easy to refer to it as opposed to the Cenobite with pins in its head, his or her head, because in this film, the character is actually played by a woman, Jamie Clayton, I believe her name is. And I think they just call her Priest in the credits or whatever. Took me way too long to figure out what credits are. But I don't have a real, like, huge, deep fandom for Hellraiser. I quite enjoyed the first one because it's not really about the Cenobites. It's more about the plot of using this puzzle box to torment people, to make them kill other people. That was an interesting concept to me. There are some gory moments involving the chains and stuff, but largely the movie is about this woman trying to bring back her undead lover. And to me, that is a unique premise for a horror movie. All of these sequels, I started watching Hellraiser 2. I didn't get too far into it. Not that I was disinterested, really, but it was just during a time where I was not focused on it, so I don't like to watch movies when I'm not really paying attention. But there are so many of these Hellraiser movies, and so hearing about a new one that was apparently kind of a fresh slate, I didn't have to see all the other ones, I was on board. And it was on Hulu, which I had Hulu, so I'm like, good, I can finally watch this movie. I sat down the other night, and I watched Hellraiser. And it was good, I guess. I don't know what Hellraiser fans are looking for, so if you're a real die-hard Hellraiser fan, then maybe you go, this movie sucks, which I have seen some reviews stating just that. I thought the movie was overall pretty good. I've seen a lot of positive reception about the film. Is it amazing? No. Is it a fine horror movie? Yeah. Basically, the premise is similar to the first one. You have this young woman named Riley, played by Odessa Erzon, something like that. Sorry, Odessa, if I butchered your name. Young actress. I think she's a little bit younger than me, so I think for the material, she did a really good job. She plays this girl. She lives in this house along with her brother, and there's also some roommates in there. The brother has a boyfriend. She has a boyfriend, and she's balancing her life. She has a issue with drugs in the house, and her brother is not having it. And her boyfriend convinces her to rob this weird industrial place, and they break into this like truck, this shipping truck, and all they find is the puzzle box. And of course, this puzzle box, if it cuts you with its little, I don't even know what you would call that, the little spike that pops out of it every time it changes configuration, the Cenobites appear, who are these angel demon things that are about pain and pleasure, mostly just pain. They come out and they start messing with ya, torturing you. I gotta be honest, I don't know the whole lore about the Cenobites. I suppose I should do more research into that topic, but I also feel like the movie should stand on its own without any source material and deliver the information that it needs of me, and I feel like this movie did. I can tell that people seek after these Cenobites. They are interdimensional beings that involve sensation. They're trying to find sensations that you can't usually find, and people seek them in order to find pleasures that they would never experience, but instead the Cenobites only offer pain that they've never experienced in the worst ways possible. They torture people, they do things with their skin, they involve chains. It's almost a little kinky, but it is just straight up torture. Now, despite the movie having a lot of gore, I wouldn't say it was in terrible taste. I think there are some pretty brutal scenes in the movie, but I wouldn't say it's anything that someone with a weak stomach couldn't deal with. I do have somewhat of a weak stomach, and I thought that overall everything was fine. There is an over-reliance, a moderate reliance on CGI in certain sequences, and some are really great practical effects. In particular, the makeup on all of the Cenobites was excellent. All of the creature designs were fantastic, whether I'm talking about the new quote-unquote pinhead, the female pinhead, or the Chatterer, the Chattering Cenobite, or the Wire Cenobite, or whichever of these Cenobites I'm talking about, I thought they all looked really quite good in terms of character designs, and in terms of how they speak and how they move. I thought they were overall creepy. I have noticed a couple of complaints, and I would have to agree with them, that Jamie Clayton as Pinhead, the new Pinhead, I guess, doesn't quite have the presence that Doug Bradley had. He was very authoritative, very dooming and haunting and foreboding every time he appeared. But here, Pinhead, or the priest, or whatever you'd like to call the entity, the Cenobite, the character played by Jamie Clayton, let's just say, she has this very monotone speaking voice, and I understand it's trying to be creepy, but it doesn't quite have the same oomph. It doesn't pack the same punch, you know what I mean? It just kind of is there. And it doesn't really, for me anyways, give me that haunting, chilled feeling that I had with Doug Bradley's performance. Is it a bad performance? No. I think that might have to do with the direction from David Bruckner, but I wouldn't say it was a direction that worked every time. Speaking of David Bruckner, by the way, he most recently directed The Night House, which was a movie, again, I had a lot of mixed feelings about. He also directed The Ritual and Southbound, just to name a few of his movies. The direction in the movie, I think, was pretty fine. The camera work was interesting. The sets were unique, and the acting was fine. There were some interesting ways in which the Cenobites appeared in the world, whereas the sets or the hallways or the rooms became like a puzzle box. I thought that was an interesting idea. There is an over-reliance on this one particular set, which is built like a giant puzzle box. I assume there was a decent portion of the budget spent on this particular location. It is a cool place, but I feel like a large chunk of the beginning, and especially the climax of the movie, take place here, and I would have liked to see a little bit more of the Cenobites' world, that dimension, that kind of hell-like dimension, and seeing what that's all about, because I was very intrigued by that, but we only see little glimpses of it. As I said, the gore and the kills were effective and creepy. The puzzle box had a really neat design. I thought the music was overall pretty creepy. Not maybe my favorite or most iconic score of recent memory, but it served its purpose in being spooky enough. And kind of some of the messages it tackles with the differences between pain and pleasure and how the line can be blurred at times, I thought they were fine. Again, I can't say the movie was amazing, but I can say it was pretty good. I think the original Hellraiser probably stands as overall a better movie. Maybe it's just because it's the original and I have some kind of thing about original movies standing on their own. But in a lot of ways, this movie is similar. It didn't quite meet that standard, but it did a good job at portraying these events of characters having to kill other characters in order to bring back someone. The only odd thing, thinking in retrospect, is that the lead character, she must kill, I think it's like 6 people or something, to bring her brother back. However, by the end of the movie, she no longer, well, I guess this is kind of a spoiler, but I hope you have seen the movie before listening to this. But by the end of the movie, she doesn't want to bring her brother back. She chooses the lament orientation of the puzzle box and decides to spend her days in regret, not having chosen to save him. I thought this was a good resolution, kind of an acceptance on her character's end to let this grief go. But at the same time, it kind of defeated the purpose of using the puzzle box throughout the movie. Toward the end, the Cenobites kind of force her hand, I suppose, and she does some clever gimmicks of actually using the puzzle box to kill certain Cenobites themselves, and I thought that was fun. But there was a little bit of untapped potential in there when it came to this character. There could have been more of a malevolence on her end. like the first movie, but giving it a different take, spinning it in a new direction. I will say it did give some unique results in terms of how the characters behave and interact with the puzzle box. For this being the newest Hellraiser 2, I kind of had an expectation of the look of the film, the sleekness, the design, the camera work, and all of that was well met. Some of these direct-to-video Hellraiser sequels look really not good. Just looking at online pictures, I haven't seen them, but just looking, they do not look that great. This movie looked very good. Again, I cannot praise the Cenobite designs enough. They're very creepy. And it was fine. It was fine. Wasn't bad by any means. Wasn't fantastic by any standard. It was a good movie. Maybe Hellraiser fans have more or less to say than I do. Maybe they really hated it, ruined their series. Maybe they really loved it and thought it was a great continuation. I'd have to probably say this is one of the better of the Hellraiser movies, just judging even the posters. You know, they say don't judge a book by its cover. I most certainly can judge a movie by its poster, because some of these posters look real trash. I'm sorry. You can just tell. They look like a straight-to-Tubi movie, which, no shots fired at Tubi. I actually love Tubi. It's one of my favorite streaming services. But I digress in saying that usually a lot of bad movies end up there, and some of these Hellraiser movies I've seen on there quite a few too many times. But Hulu did a fine job with this Hellraiser movie. Netflix, you did a fine job with Mr. Harrigan's Phone. Munsters, not so much. Munsters was supposed to go to theaters, but it didn't, and I don't blame Universal at all for changing it to 1440 and being done with it. So there you go. Hauntformer's thoughts, Mac Ralston's thoughts on the Munsters, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, and Hellraiser 2022. Leave your thoughts about each of these movies in the comments below. Let me know what you thought about these projects, and I will be back soon to talk about more horror-themed content very, very soon. Thank you for listening, and remember, for all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer.